Tonight, let us embark on a gentle journey through time to an age when the edges of maps held more mystery than certainty, and when brave souls first dared to sail beyond the horizons of the known world. Allow your body to settle comfortably as we explore the dawn of the Age of Discovery. In the soft twilight of the medieval era, as the 14th century gave way to the 15th, Europe was a continent awakening to new possibilities. The known world, a comfortable patchwork of familiar lands surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, was about to expand in ways that would forever transform human understanding of our planet. Imagine a world where geography was as much legend as fact, where learned scholars believed the earth was round. Yes, this was indeed common knowledge among educated people of the time, but where the true size of our world and the extent of its lands and seas remained profoundly misunderstood. In this world, maps showed Europe, parts of Asia, and the northern shores of Africa in some detail, but beyond these familiar territories lay vast unknowns, sometimes decorated with fantastical creatures and warnings. To the east lay lands of legendary wealth and splendor. The silks of China, the spices of India and the East Indies, the porcelain and pearls of distant kingdoms, all these treasures made their slow way westward along ancient trading routes, growing more precious with each passing mile. By the time a handful of pepper or cinnamon reached the markets of Venice or Lisbon, its value had multiplied many times over, enriching each merchant who had carried it a portion of its long journey. As your breathing deepens and your muscles relax, envision these precious goods traveling along the storied Silk Road, carried by caravans across the sun-baked deserts and rugged mountain passes of Central Asia. Picture them loaded onto ships in the ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, sailing past ancient cities before finally reaching European hands, each item bearing the invisible imprint of the many worlds it had passed through. But as the 15th century unfolded, these traditional pathways faced mounting obstacles. The Ottoman Empire's expansion, culminating in the fall of Constantinople in 1453, placed formidable barriers between Europe and the sources of these eastern riches. The established maritime powers of Venice and Genoa jealously guarded their privileged position as Europe's gateways to Eastern trade. For nations on the Atlantic rim of Europe, especially Portugal and Spain, these developments posed a challenge that would spark a remarkable response. As your mind drifts gently toward the borders of sleep, let us explore the remarkable confluence of innovations, ambitions, and circumstances that made the Age of Discovery possible. The ships that would carry explorers into unknown waters needed to be different from anything that had come before. Medieval European vessels had been designed primarily for the relatively gentle Mediterranean or for cautious coastal navigation. The vast, storm-tossed Atlantic, with its unpredictable weather, presented far greater challenges. Imagine standing on a sunlit Portuguese shore, watching shipwrights at work on a revolutionary vessel, the Caravel. With its distinctive combination of European and Arab design elements, this ship would become the embodiment of the age of exploration. Its hull was sleeker than traditional European vessels, its maneuverability superior, and most importantly, its triangular lateen sails, adopted from Arab seafaring tradition, allowed it to sail much closer to the wind than square-rigged ships. This meant caravels could navigate effectively against prevailing winds and currents, making possible voyages that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. As the gentle waves of drowsiness begin to wash over you, consider the navigational tools that guided these wooden vessels through uncharted waters. The magnetic compass, originally developed in China and brought to Europe through contact with Arab traders, provided direction even when clouds obscured the stars. The astrolabe and quadrant allowed navigators to determine their latitude by measuring the angle of the sun or North Star above the horizon. Portuguese navigators developed and refined the technique of volta do mar, the turn of the sea, recognizing that in the Atlantic, sailing in a seemingly indirect route often proved faster and safer than attempting a direct course. This counterintuitive approach, sailing away from one's destination before turning toward it, reflected a growing understanding of oceanic wind patterns that would prove crucial for transoceanic voyages. Each voyage contributed to an accumulating treasury of knowledge. Portolan charts, with their detailed coastlines and compass roses, grew more accurate with each expedition. Islands once thought legendary were carefully positioned on maps. Depths were sounded, currents noted, coastal landmarks recorded. The unknown was gradually becoming known, one nautical mile at a time. As your body grows heavier and your thoughts more tranquil, consider the intellectual climate that nurtured these explorations. The early Renaissance was breathing new life into European thought, encouraging empirical observation and practical knowledge alongside classical learning. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century allowed geographic knowledge, travel accounts, and navigational techniques to spread more widely than ever before. In Portugal, a figure emerged who would become central to the story of exploration, Prince Henry, later known as the Navigator. Though he rarely sailed himself, Henry established a center of nautical studies at Sagres on Portugal's southwestern tip, where he gathered cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and experienced sailors. This informal research center became a crucible for the knowledge and techniques that would make systematic exploration possible. The motivations driving this age of discovery were as varied as they were powerful. The quest for gold and silver drew many, as European supplies of precious metals were limited and insufficient for growing economies. African gold from regions south of the Sahara had long reached Europe through North African intermediaries. Might there be a direct route to these sources of wealth? As your consciousness drifts ever closer to sleep, imagine the bustling spice markets of medieval Europe, the air rich with the exotic scents of distant lands, the sharp tang of pepper, the sweet warmth of cinnamon, the distinctive aroma of cloves. These spices were not merely luxuries, but essentials, preserving food in an age before refrigeration and serving as medicines in a time of limited pharmaceutical options. The possibility of reaching the sources of these precious commodities directly, bypassing multiple middlemen, offered the prospect of tremendous profit. Religion, too, played its part in this unfolding drama. European Christianity was in an expansionist phase, seeking to spread the faith to new regions and peoples. The centuries-old conflict with Islamic powers gave exploration a dimension of geopolitical strategy. Rumors persisted of Prester John, a legendary Christian king said to rule a wealthy realm somewhere in Africa or Asia, who might become a powerful ally against mutual adversaries. The Portuguese took the lead in these early explorations, beginning a systematic process of venturing down the west coast of Africa. Each expedition sailed a little further than the last, establishing trading posts, mapping coastlines, and gathering information about winds, currents, and potential resources. This methodical approach, building carefully on accumulated knowledge, would eventually lead to one of history's most significant geographical achievements, the rounding of Africa and the opening of a sea route to India. As you hover at the threshold of sleep, imagine those early wooden ships setting sail from familiar harbors, their crews watching the landmarks of home recede before turning their gaze toward horizons where no European had sailed before. Consider the courage required to venture beyond the boundaries of the known world, beyond the range of rescue should disaster strike, guided only by the stars, the compass, and the accumulated wisdom of those who had sailed a portion of the way before. Let the gentle rhythm of ocean waves against wooden hulls and the soft billowing of canvas sails in the wind carry you toward peaceful slumber. As your consciousness drifts, like those explorers' ships, into uncharted waters, know that we will continue our journey in the next chapter, following Prince Henry the Navigator and the Portuguese explorers as they begin their systematic ventures down the African coast. But for now, rest gently in the cradle of history as the first light of the age of discovery breaks softly on the horizon of human knowledge. As you continue to relax and let your mind drift, we turn our attention to a remarkable figure whose vision and determination set in motion the age of exploration. On the southwestern edge of Europe, on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, Prince Henry of Portugal would establish a legacy that would forever change the course of human history. Prince Henry was born in 1394, the third son of King Joan I of Portugal and his English wife, Philippa of Lancaster. As a younger son, Henry would not inherit the throne, freeing him to pursue other ambitions. His background was shaped by a unique combination of circumstances that positioned him perfectly to become the architect of Portugal's maritime expansion. The Portugal of Henry's youth was a nation finding its identity. Having secured independence from Castile in 1385 and completed its portion of the Reconquista with the capture of Ceuta in 1415, Portugal enjoyed relative stability compared to many European realms. The capture of Ceuta, a Muslim city on the North African coast opposite Gibraltar, was particularly significant for young Prince Henry, who participated in the expedition at the age of 21. Ceuta was a prosperous trading port connected to the trans-Saharan trade routes that brought gold, ivory, and other precious commodities from sub-Saharan Africa. The experience opened Henry's eyes to the potential wealth that lay beyond the familiar Mediterranean world and sparked what would become a lifelong fascination with exploration and discovery. Contrary to his popular title, the Navigator, bestowed upon him centuries later by admiring historians, Prince Henry himself rarely sailed on exploratory voyages. His contribution was as a visionary, organizer, and patron. Around 1418, Henry established his famous School of Navigation at Sagres on Portugal's southwestern tip. While not a formal educational institution in the modern sense, it was a gathering place for knowledge and expertise in the nautical arts. As you envision this wind-swept promontory jutting into the Atlantic, imagine the community that formed there under Henry's patronage. cartographers meticulously drawing and updating maps based on the latest voyages, astronomers observing the night sky to improve navigational techniques, experienced ship captains sharing practical knowledge with younger sailors, shipwrights discussing improvements to vessel design, translators working on Arabic geographical texts, all united by the prince's vision of pushing beyond the known world. Henry's motives were complex and multifaceted. Certainly, there was the lure of wealth, the gold of West Africa, the possibility of circumventing Arab and Venetian middlemen in the spice trade. Religious zeal also played a significant role. Henry was a devout Christian who saw exploration as a means to spread the faith and find Christian allies against Islamic powers. The popular legend of Prester John, a supposed Christian king ruling a wealthy realm somewhere in Africa or Asia, particularly captivated Henry's imagination. But beyond material and spiritual concerns, there seems to have been in Henry a genuine thirst for knowledge, a desire to uncover the secrets of the world that lay beyond the horizon. This intellectual curiosity, combined with the resources of a royal prince and the strategic vision of a military leader, made him uniquely positioned to launch the age of exploration. The Portuguese explorations began cautiously, step by step, advancing a little further down the African coast with each expedition. When Henry began his project, European ships had rarely ventured beyond Cape Bojador on the coast of present-day Western Sahara. This cape had taken on almost mythical significance as a point of no return, with sailors sharing ominous tales of boiling seas, sea monsters, and winds that would prevent any ship from returning home. Year after year, Henry sent expeditions to attempt passage beyond this dreaded cape. Each time the sailors returned without success, frightened by the treacherous currents and sandbanks, or perhaps more significantly, by the psychological barrier of venturing into the truly unknown. It was not until 1434, after more than a dozen failed attempts, that one of Henry's captains, Gil Eanes, finally succeeded in rounding Cape Bojador. This breakthrough, while seemingly modest in geographical terms, represented an enormous psychological victory. The mythical barrier had been broken, and the seas beyond proved navigable. This success emboldened further exploration, and the pace of discovery accelerated. Within a few years, Portuguese caravels had reached the Senegal River and the region known as Guinea, where they found fertile lands, ivory, and most importantly, gold. As you continue to relax and your thoughts follow these brave sailors on their journeys, let us explore some of the most significant discoveries made during Prince Henry's lifetime, each one expanding the known world a little further. In 1419, Portuguese ships rediscovered Madeira, a small archipelago of islands in the Atlantic, about 520 miles from the Portuguese coast. These islands had been known to European sailors since the 14th century, but were uninhabited and largely forgotten. Under Henry's direction, colonization began in 1420, with settlers introducing crops such as wheat and, most significantly, sugar. The warm climate and fertile volcanic soil proved ideal for sugar cultivation, and Madeira soon became an important producer of this valuable commodity. Further out in the Atlantic, the Azores archipelago was discovered in 1427, nearly 900 miles from Portugal. Like Madeira, these 9 islands were uninhabited, and colonization began under Henry's oversight in 1439. The strategic importance of these islands cannot be overstated. They would later serve as crucial way stations for ships crossing the Atlantic. In 1445, Portuguese explorer Dinas Dias reached Cape Verde, the westernmost point of Africa, while seeking a route to the Gambia River. The name, meaning Green Cape, reflected the contrast with the more arid regions to the north. The nearby Cape Verde Islands were discovered around 1460 and would later become another important Portuguese colony and stopping point for transatlantic voyages. The most significant economic discovery came in 1471 when Portuguese explorers reached the area known as the Gold Coast in present day Ghana. Here, they established the trading post of São Jorge da Mina, later known as Elmina, which became the center of a thriving gold trade. At last, Portugal had direct access to the gold of West Africa, bypassing the trans-Saharan routes controlled by Muslim traders. While Prince Henry would not live to see many of these later discoveries, having passed away in 1460, his vision continued to guide Portuguese exploration for decades. His contributions to the Age of Discovery were manifold and transformative. Let us reflect on his legacy as you sink deeper into relaxation. Henry fundamentally changed the nature of European expansion. Before him, European knowledge of Africa was largely limited to the Mediterranean coast and based on second-hand accounts and ancient texts. Henry's systematic program of exploration, with each voyage building upon the knowledge gained from previous expeditions, replaced speculation with first-hand observation. The prince established a model for exploration that would be followed by subsequent European powers. The combination of royal patronage, commercial interests, religious motivation, and scientific inquiry. This model proved remarkably effective at generating the necessary resources and commitment for sustained exploration. Perhaps most importantly, Henry fostered a culture of innovation and record keeping. Cartographers at his court diligently recorded each new discovery, creating ever more accurate maps of the African coast. Navigational techniques were refined based on practical experience. The design of ships evolved to meet the challenges of Atlantic exploration. This accumulation of knowledge and technology made possible the even greater voyages that would follow in later decades. The economic impact of Henry's initiative was profound. Before his time, gold from West Africa reached Europe only after passing through multiple intermediaries along trans-Saharan routes, with each adding to the cost. Portuguese ships now connected directly with the sources of this gold, dramatically increasing the supply of the precious metal in Europe and strengthening Portuguese royal finances. Similarly, the development of sugar plantations on Madeira created a new source of wealth. Sugar had previously been a luxury import from the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Madeira's production brought the price down somewhat, though it remained valuable enough to generate substantial profits. The human consequences of these early explorations must also be acknowledged. As Portuguese ships ventured further down the African coast, they began to engage in the capture and transport of enslaved Africans. What began as a relatively small-scale activity during Henry's lifetime would, in later centuries, grow into the transatlantic slave trade with devastating consequences for millions of people. The religious dimension of Henry's project yielded mixed results. While the prince's hope of finding Prester John remained unfulfilled during his lifetime, Portuguese explorers did eventually establish contact with Christian Ethiopia. More significantly, the navigational knowledge accumulated during his lifetime later enabled Portuguese ships to reach India and beyond, bringing them into contact with diverse religious traditions and spreading Christianity to new regions, though rarely in the peaceful manner Henry might have envisioned. As your body grows heavier and your thoughts drift with the Atlantic currents, imagine the legacy of charts, logbooks, and navigational knowledge accumulating in Portugal during the decades of Henry's patronage. Each small discovery, each careful observation, each technical innovation contributing to a revolution in how Europeans understood their world. Prince Henry the Navigator died in 1460, but the momentum he had created continued to propel Portuguese exploration forward. In the decades following his death, Portuguese captains would venture further and further down the African coast, each voyage adding to the growing body of knowledge. The ultimate goal, finding a sea route to India and the Spice Islands, remained elusive but increasingly seemed within reach. As the 15th century progressed, Portuguese ships pushed steadily southward along the African coast. Antonio Fernandes reached Sierra Leone in 1446. Pedro de Sintra explored the Liberian coast in 1461. In 1473, Lopo Gonçalves crossed the equator for the first time in recorded European history, disproving ancient beliefs that the equatorial regions were too hot for human survival. Diogo Cao explored the mouth of the Congo River and the coast of modern-day Angola between 1482 and 1486. These explorations were not merely geographic achievements. They established trading relationships with African kingdoms, created new commercial networks, and began to map the complex human geography of West Africa. With each voyage, the Portuguese accumulated more accurate navigational data, improved their understanding of wind and current patterns, and refined their shipbuilding techniques. The Portuguese crown formalized its claims to these new trade routes in 1481 with the construction of the fortress at Elmina on the Gold Coast, establishing a permanent European presence on the sub-Saharan African coast. The fortress protected Portuguese trading interests and served as a base for further exploration. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the night sky above these early explorers, the same stars we see today guiding their vessels into unknown waters. Consider the courage it took to sail beyond the edges of the map, and the mixture of wonder and trepidation they must have felt as unfamiliar coastlines emerged from the horizon. In our next chapter, we will follow Bartholomeu Dias as he rounds the southern tip of Africa, opening the final stretch of the sea route to India. But for now, let the gentle sounds of waves against wooden hulls and the whispered promises of discovery carry you into peaceful slumber as the legacy of Prince Henry continues to unfold in your dreams. As your mind continues to drift through the mists of history, we arrive at a pivotal moment in the story of exploration, the voyage of Bartholomew Dias around the southern tip of Africa. This journey would finally prove that a sea route to India was possible, opening the door to a new age of global commerce and cultural exchange. By the mid-1480s, Portuguese explorers had mapped the western coast of Africa as far south as modern-day Namibia. Each expedition had ventured a little further than the last, methodically expanding European knowledge of the African continent. The ultimate goal, Finding a sea route to India and its valuable spice trade still lay tantalizingly beyond reach. King João II of Portugal, continuing the vision of his great uncle Prince Henry the Navigator, remained determined to achieve this ambition. Bartholomeu Dias was a member of the royal household and an experienced navigator who had already participated in earlier expeditions along the African coast. In 1487, the king entrusted him with a momentous mission to sail beyond all previous Portuguese voyages and discover whether Africa could indeed be circumnavigated. Little is known about Dias's early life. Like many historical figures of his era, he emerges from the shadows of time only when he steps onto the stage of significant events. We know he was of noble birth and had received the education and training typical for those in royal service, including navigation and cartography. His selection to lead such an important expedition suggests he had already proven his capabilities as a mariner and leader. The expedition departed from the Tagus River in Lisbon in August 1487. Dias commanded a small fleet consisting of two armed caravels of approximately 50 tons each and a supply ship. The caravels were the workhorses of Portuguese exploration, relatively small but remarkably seaworthy vessels with a combination of square and lateen triangular sails that allowed them to sail both with the wind and against it. These nimble ships had proven their worth in decades of exploration along the African coast. As you imagine these wooden vessels setting out into the vast Atlantic, consider the courage required of Dias and his crew. While they followed in the wake of previous explorers for much of their journey, they knew they would ultimately sail beyond all known European experience into waters no European had ever seen, along coasts no European had ever mapped. The expedition initially followed the established route down the African coast, stopping at Portuguese trading posts along the way. At Sierra Leone, they would have found familiar Portuguese settlements. Further south, they reached Elmina on the Gold Coast, the significant Portuguese trading fort established in 1482 to protect Portuguese interests in the gold trade. Beyond these familiar stops, Dias sailed to the Congo River, which previous Portuguese expeditions had reached. Here, Dias set up a padrão, one of the stone pillars carried from Portugal specifically for this purpose. These pillars, carved with the Portuguese coat of arms and a cross, served as territorial markers and testament to Portuguese priority in discovery. After leaving the Congo behind, Dias entered waters that, while not completely unknown to Europeans, were still only vaguely charted. He continued past the furthest point reached by Diogo Cao, the previous Portuguese explorer who had ventured as far as Cape Cross in modern Namibia. As Dias sailed into the unknown, he encountered increasingly difficult conditions. The cold Benguela current, flowing northward along the western coast of southern Africa, created challenging sailing conditions. The coast became more barren and inhospitable, with the Namib Desert extending nearly to the shoreline in many places, offering little in the way of provisions or fresh water. Near the southern end of modern-day Angola, Dias left another padrão and made a fateful decision. Instead of continuing to hug the coastline, as previous explorers had done, he decided to sail out into the open ocean in a southwesterly direction, leaving the African coast behind. This bold maneuver was likely influenced by his understanding of wind patterns in the South Atlantic, a knowledge accumulated through decades of Portuguese exploration. For 13 days, Dias and his small fleet sailed through the open ocean out of sight of land. Imagine the tension aboard those small wooden vessels as they traveled through unfamiliar waters, with no landmarks to guide them, relying only on the stars, crude navigational instruments, and the captain's judgment. The seas grew colder and the weather more tempestuous as they sailed southward. Then, sensing they had gone far enough south, Diaz changed course to the east, expecting to reconnect with the African coastline. Days passed with no sight of land, raising anxiety among the crew. Had they missed Africa entirely? Was there perhaps no southern end to the continent after all? Finally, on February 3rd, 1488, they sighted land, but not the western coast they had left behind. Instead, they had reached what is now Mossel Bay on the southern coast of South Africa, east of the Cape of Good Hope. Without realizing it, Dias had rounded the southern tip of Africa. Sailing eastward along this unknown coast, the expedition encountered something that must have seemed miraculous: river mouths flowing toward them from the interior of Africa. These eastern flowing rivers confirmed they were no longer on the western coast. Africa did indeed have a southern end, and they had passed it. The route to India, sought for so long, was theoretically open. Dias continued eastward along the southern coast of Africa, setting up another padron at Quaihook. He wished to press on, perhaps all the way to India, but his crew had endured months at sea in increasingly difficult conditions. Food was spoiling, the ships needed repairs, and morale was low. Reluctantly, Dias agreed to turn back after reaching the Great Fish River in what is now South Africa's Eastern Cape Province. It was only during the return journey, keeping the coast in sight this time, that Dias actually laid eyes on the Cape of Good Hope itself, the southwestern tip of Africa. He named it the Cape of Storms, Cabo das Tormentas, due to the notoriously harsh weather conditions. It was King João II who later renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, Cabo da Boa Esperança, recognizing that its discovery offered hope for the long-sought sea route to India. The return journey was arduous, but ultimately successful. The expedition made their way back along the coast of Africa, recovering the supply ship they had left behind earlier in the voyage, though only 3 of the original crew were still alive. After an absence of 16 months and 17 days, Dias and his fleet returned to Lisbon in December 1488. As you continue to relax, drifting with these ancient mariners on their homeward journey, consider the significance of what Bartholomeu Dias had accomplished. His voyage had definitively proven that Africa could be circumnavigated and that a sea route to India was geographically possible. This confirmation transformed theoretical possibility into practical opportunity, opening the door for the voyages that would follow. Dias's journey represented the culmination of decades of systematic Portuguese exploration. Since the time of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese ships had been gradually pushing south along the African coast. Each expedition built upon the knowledge gained by its predecessors, creating an ever more detailed understanding of winds, currents, coastlines, and navigational challenges. Dias stood on the shoulders of these earlier explorers, and his achievement was the fruit of Portugal's long-term commitment to the project of exploration. The psychological impact of rounding the Cape cannot be overstated. For European mariners, this represented venturing truly beyond the known world into unmapped waters. The successful return of Diaz and his crew demonstrated that such voyages were possible, that the unfamiliar could be navigated, and that the boundaries of the known world could be pushed back through courage, skill, and determination. Despite the magnitude of his achievement, Diaz did not immediately receive a new commission to continue his explorations. King Joan II was preoccupied with other matters, including negotiations with Spain following Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1492. The king died in 1495, and it fell to his successor, Manuel I, to pursue the opening that Diaz had created. In 1497, nearly a decade after Diaz's voyage around the Cape, a new expedition was finally prepared to complete the journey to India. Vasco da Gama was appointed to lead this venture, and Bartholomeu Diaz assisted in the preparations, helping to select and prepare the ships. Diaz himself would accompany the expedition for part of its journey, guiding them as far as the Cape Verde Islands before returning to Portugal. The later years of Bartholomew Diaz's life are not well documented. We know he continued to serve the Portuguese crown, and in 1500 he joined the fleet of Pedro Alvarez Cabral, which was the second Portuguese expedition to India. Ironically, after successfully navigating the treacherous Cape of Good Hope on multiple occasions, Diaz met his end in a shipwreck off that same cape during a terrible storm on May 29, 1500. The sea that had been the theater of his greatest triumph became the place of his final rest. Bartholomew Diaz's legacy extends far beyond his own lifetime. His voyage around the Cape of Good Hope opened the maritime route to India and the Far East, breaking the monopoly on Asian trade that had been held by Arab merchants and Italian city-states. This new route would transform global commerce, shifting economic power toward Atlantic nations and away from the Mediterranean. The Portuguese Empire that flourished in the 16th century, with its string of trading posts and fortified positions stretching from Brazil to Japan, owed its existence in large part to the route pioneered by Diaz. His voyage was a crucial link in the chain of exploration that connected Europe to the wider world, ultimately leading to the global economy we know today. Yet for Diaz himself, there must have been a bittersweet quality to his achievement. While he had proven that the route to India existed, it would be Vasco da Gama who completed the journey and received the greater share of historical recognition. Like many pioneers, Diaz opened a door that others would walk through to greater acclaim. As you drift toward sleep, imagine those small wooden ships battling the harsh winds and currents around the southern tip of Africa. Consider the mix of fear and exhilaration the sailors must have felt as they realized they had passed beyond the edge of all European knowledge. The cold spray of ocean waves, the creaking of wooden timbers, the snap of canvas sails in the wind, these sensory experiences accompanied one of humanity's great geographic achievements. While Diaz had proven that a sea route around Africa was possible, the actual journey to India remained to be completed. In our next chapter, we will follow Vasco da Gama as he builds upon Diaz's discovery to finally establish direct European contact with India by sea, forever changing patterns of global trade and cultural exchange. But for now, let the rolling waves of the South Atlantic and the triumph of human courage and perseverance lull you toward peaceful slumber. As your mind continues to float Through the currents of history, we now turn to one of the most significant voyages in the age of exploration, the expedition of Vasco da Gama that finally established the coveted sea route to India. This journey would complete the decades-long Portuguese quest and forever transform global trade patterns. Nearly a decade had passed since Bartholomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the southern tip of Africa could be navigated. During this interval, momentous events had reshaped European understanding of the world. Christopher Columbus had sailed westward across the Atlantic in 1492, encountering the Americas while searching for an alternative route to Asia. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had divided the non-European world between Portugal and Spain, and Portugal had seen a change of monarch, with King Manuel I ascending to the throne in 1495. King Manuel was determined to continue the Portuguese program of exploration and fulfill the dream of establishing direct trade with India. He sought a capable commander for this ambitious venture, someone who combined nautical experience with the strength of character needed to lead men on a dangerous journey into largely unknown waters. His choice fell upon Vasco da Gama. Born around 1469 in the coastal town of Sines, Vasco da Gama came from the lower nobility. His father, Estevão da Gama, was a knight in the household of Prince Ferdinand, Duke of Viseu, and had been initially considered to lead the India expedition before his death. Young Vasco followed in his father's footsteps, entering royal service and developing expertise in navigation and naval warfare. Though we have limited details about his early career, he had clearly impressed the king sufficiently to be entrusted with this momentous expedition. The preparations for the voyage were extensive and meticulous. King Manuel spared no expense, recognizing the potential rewards of establishing direct trade with India. 4 ships were specially constructed for the journey. The São Gabriel, which would serve as da Gama's flagship, and the São Rafael, commanded by his brother Paulo da Gama, were square-rigged naus of about 100 tons each. The Barrio was a smaller, faster caravel, and a 4th vessel served primarily as a storage ship carrying additional supplies. Collectively, the fleet carried approximately 170 men. The ships were equipped with the best navigational instruments available: astrolabes, quadrants, compasses, and detailed charts compiled from previous Portuguese voyages. They carried naval artillery for protection and a variety of trade goods, including gold, silver, coral, copper, and mercury, intended to establish commercial relations in distant lands. Additionally, the expedition brought stone padrones, pillars to be erected as markers of Portuguese discovery, and territorial claims. Equally important was the human expertise aboard. The expedition included experienced sailors who had navigated the Atlantic, interpreters familiar with Arabic and other languages they might encounter, and at least one sailor who had previously visited India by the traditional overland route. This man, known as Fernão Martins, would prove invaluable when they eventually reached their destination. On July 8th, 1497, the small fleet departed from Lisbon. As the ships sailed down the Tagus River and into the open Atlantic, crowds gathered to watch. For many of the sailors, this would be the last time they would see their homeland. The risks of such a voyage were well understood: storms, shipwrecks, disease, starvation, and potential hostile encounters in foreign lands all claimed the lives of many explorers. Yet the potential glory and rewards drove men to undertake such perilous journeys. As you imagine these wooden vessels setting out into the vast ocean, sailing with the rhythm of waves and wind, allow your own body to settle into deeper relaxation, carried along by the currents of this historical narrative. The initial stage of the voyage followed the established Portuguese route down the west coast of Africa. By this time, Portugal had established trading posts at key locations along this coast, creating a familiar path for the early portion of the journey. The fleet stopped briefly at the Canary Islands, then sailed to the Cape Verde Islands, where they took on fresh provisions. Here, da Gama made a critical and innovative navigational decision. Rather than hugging the African coastline, as previous explorers had done, he sailed far out into the Atlantic in a giant arc before turning back toward the Cape of Good Hope. This maneuver, known as the Volta do Mar, turn of the sea, took advantage of prevailing winds and currents in the South Atlantic. While it meant sailing more than 3,000 miles out of the way, it actually saved time and reduced the risk of encountering contrary winds near the African coast. For nearly 3 months, the fleet sailed through the open ocean, out of sight of land. Imagine the psychological challenge of those months at sea, the endless horizon, the isolation, the complete dependence on wind and weather, and the faith required in the captain's navigation. Fresh water and food began to run low, and scurvy, a painful disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, began to afflict the crew. Finally, on November 4th, the fleet sighted land on the western coast of what is now South Africa. They anchored at St. Helena Bay, where they were able to take on fresh water and meat through trading with local inhabitants. These initial encounters were sometimes tense, but generally peaceful, establishing a pattern that would repeat throughout the voyage. Cautious contact with unfamiliar peoples, communication through gestures, and trade, and the gradual building of understanding. After replenishing their supplies, the fleet continued around the Cape of Good Hope in late November, encountering the fierce storms that had given the cape its original name, Cape of Storms. The challenging waters tested the ships and the resolve of their crews, but they successfully navigated around the southern tip of Africa and began sailing northward along the eastern coast. On Christmas Day, 1497, they reached a stretch of coastline that da Gama named Natal, Christmas in Portuguese, in honor of the day. This area in modern South Africa still bears that name. The fleet continued northward, encountering increasing signs of trading networks connected to the broader Indian Ocean world. In early January, they reached the mouth of a river da Gama named Rio dos Bons Sinais, River of Good Signs, now the Zambezi River in Mozambique, where they erected a padrone and spent several weeks recovering from scurvy and repairing their ships. By March, the expedition had reached Mozambique Island, where they encountered Muslim traders and learned they had entered a well-established commercial network spanning the Indian Ocean. Here they first presented themselves as merchants seeking to trade in India, but their unfamiliarity with local customs and the Muslim traders' suspicion of Christians led to tense situations. Eventually, the hostility forced them to depart, but not before they had gathered valuable information about the sea routes to India. Sailing northward along the East African coast, they reached Mombasa, in modern Kenya, in April. Again, initial welcome turned to suspicion, and da Gama prudently decided to continue to Malindi, where he received a more favorable reception. The ruler of Malindi, eager to establish trade relations, and possibly seeing the Portuguese as a counterweight to rival coastal cities, provided da Gama with a valuable gift, an experienced Arab navigator familiar with the crossing to India. This navigator, often referred to as Ibn Majid, though his exact identity remains disputed by historians, possessed detailed knowledge of the monsoon winds that governed sailing in the Indian Ocean. These seasonal wind patterns had been understood by Indian Ocean sailors for centuries, creating predictable trading cycles between East Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond. With this expert guidance, da Gama's fleet departed Malindi on April the 24th and set course across the Arabian Sea. For 23 days, they sailed across open water, the longest non-stop sea voyage in European history to that point. The consistent monsoon winds carried them steadily eastward, and on May 20th, 1498, they sighted the mountains of the Indian subcontinent near Calicut, modern Kozhikode, on the Malabar coast. After nearly 11 months of voyage, through uncharted waters and around a continent, Vasco da Gama had achieved what generations of Portuguese explorers had been working toward, reaching India by sea. As you contemplate this achievement, allow yourself to sink deeper into relaxation, carried by the historical currents of this momentous journey. When da Gama's ships anchored off Calicut, they had arrived at one of the most important trading centers on India's western coast. Calicut was a prosperous city where Arab merchants exchanged goods from the Middle East and Europe for Indian spices and textiles, Chinese porcelain and silk, and other valuable commodities from across Asia. It was ruled by a Hindu monarch known as the Zamorin, who derived considerable revenue from this international trade. The Portuguese expedition sent an envoy ashore with gifts for the Zamorin, hoping to establish friendly relations and trading privileges. However, the gifts, items that might have impressed African rulers, seemed paltry compared to the lavish offerings the Zamorin regularly received from wealthy Arab and Indian merchants. This initial misstep highlighted the Portuguese lack of understanding of the sophisticated commercial and diplomatic customs of the Indian Ocean world. Despite this awkward beginning, da Gama was granted an audience with the Zamorin. He presented himself as an ambassador from a powerful Christian king seeking to establish trade, emphasizing the potential benefits of direct commerce between Portugal and Calicut. The Zamorin was generally receptive, but remained cautious, aware of the potential disruption to existing trade relationships, particularly with the established Arab merchant community. The Arab merchants, recognizing the potential threat to their commercial interests, actively worked to undermine the Portuguese position. They pointed out that the Portuguese had brought few goods of value to trade and questioned their true intentions. These tensions complicated da Gama's efforts to establish a firm commercial foothold in Calicut. After weeks of difficult negotiations, da Gama managed to acquire a small cargo of Indian spices and detailed information about the local trading systems. However, relations deteriorated when the Zamorin insisted that the Portuguese leave behind some of their men as a guarantee of their return, a common practice in Indian Ocean trade, but one that da Gama was unwilling to accept. When several Portuguese were detained, da Gama responded by taking hostages of his own, eventually securing the release of his men, but further damaging relations with the Zamorin. On August 29th, 1498, having spent over 3 months in Calicut, da Gama's fleet began the long journey home. The return voyage proved even more arduous than the outward journey. Contrary winds in the Indian Ocean meant the crossing to Africa took nearly 3 months instead of the 23 days of the outward voyage. Scurvy again ravaged the crew, and many men died during this crossing. By January 1499, the fleet reached Malindi, where they could finally recover and take on fresh provisions. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope in March and continued northward along the western coast of Africa. To speed the return and deliver news of the successful voyage, da Gama sent the faster Barrio ahead, while he continued more slowly in the São Gabriel. The Barrio, under the command of Nicolau Coelho, reached Portugal in July 1499, bringing the first news of the expedition's success. Da Gama himself arrived in September, having stopped along the way at the Cape Verde Islands, where his brother Paulo had fallen ill. Paulo died before reaching Portugal, adding a note of personal tragedy to da Gama's triumphant return. When Vasco da Gama finally stepped ashore in Lisbon, only 55 of the original 170 men had survived the 2-year voyage. The human cost had been enormous, but so too were the achievements. The expedition had proven that a direct sea route to India was practical, had made first contact with Indian rulers, and had brought back spices and information that promised vast commercial opportunities. King Manuel welcomed da Gama with great honor, granting him the title Admiral of the Indian Ocean and substantial financial rewards. The small cargo of pepper and cinnamon the fleet had brought back, though modest in quantity, was sufficient to demonstrate the immense potential profit of direct trade with India. When the costs of the expedition were compared with the value of this small cargo, it was clear that future voyages could yield enormous returns. The significance of Vasco da Gama's voyage extended far beyond the immediate commercial gains. For Portugal, it represented the culmination of nearly a century of systematic exploration initiated by Prince Henry the Navigator. The Portuguese now possessed the knowledge and experience to establish regular maritime contact with the richest trading regions of Asia, bypassing the traditional overland routes controlled by Arab merchants and Italian city-states. For the broader world, the consequences were even more profound. Da Gama's voyage began the process of connecting the previously separate trading worlds of the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, initiating the creation of truly global trade networks. These connections would transform economies, societies, and cultures across multiple continents in the centuries that followed. The traditional spice trade, which had flowed through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf to Mediterranean ports, would gradually be redirected around Africa to Atlantic Europe. This shift undermined the commercial position of Venice and other Italian trading cities, while elevating the importance of Lisbon, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and eventually London. The economic center of Europe began to shift from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, a process that would continue for centuries. For the Indian Ocean world, the arrival of armed European ships heralded a new era. The Portuguese, and later other European powers, introduced a more militarized approach to trade, using naval power to establish fortified trading posts and enforce commercial monopolies. This approach, contrasted sharply with the generally more open trading practices that had previously characterized Indian Ocean commerce. As you drift deeper into relaxation, consider the personal experiences of Vasco da Gama himself. Having led a voyage of unprecedented distance and difficulty, having lost his brother and the majority of his crew, yet having accomplished his mission and returned to acclaim and reward, what complex emotions must have filled his mind as he stepped back onto Portuguese soil. Da Gama would lead two more expeditions to India. In 1502, he returned with a much larger fleet of 20 ships, establishing Portuguese military dominance in the Indian Ocean through often brutal tactics. His final voyage came in 1524 when he was appointed as Portuguese Viceroy of India. Tragically, he died in Cochin, modern Kochi, just 3 months after arriving, falling victim to illness like so many Europeans in tropical climates. He was buried in India, though his remains were later returned to Portugal, where they now rest in the Jeronimos Monastery in Lisbon. The route pioneered by da Gama would become the foundation of Portugal's maritime empire in Asia. Within a few years of his voyage, Portugal had established trading posts in East Africa, India, Malacca, the Spice Islands, and eventually China and Japan. For over a century, Portuguese ships dominated the sea lanes between Europe and Asia, generating immense wealth that transformed tiny Portugal into a major power. As your body settles into deeper rest, imagine the creaking wooden ships returning to Lisbon harbor, sails billowing with the same winds that had carried them around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Picture the sun-weathered faces of the surviving sailors, forever changed by what they had seen and experienced, bringing back not just spices and goods, but new knowledge of distant lands and peoples. In our next chapter, we will shift our focus across the Atlantic, where Christopher Columbus's voyages were opening an entirely different chapter in the age of exploration. But for now, let the achievements of Vasco da Gama and his brave crew guide you toward peaceful slumber as the waves of history continue to carry us through the great age of discovery. As you continue to relax and drift through the currents of history, we now turn our attention across the Atlantic, where another momentous chapter in the age of exploration was unfolding. While the Portuguese sought their eastern route to India around Africa, a Genoese navigator with an ambitious plan would sail west into the unknown, forever changing our understanding of the world. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy, around 1451. The son of a wool weaver, he received little formal education but developed a passion for the sea early in life. By his teens, he was already sailing on commercial voyages in the Mediterranean. As a young man, Columbus moved to Portugal, then the center of European maritime exploration, where he married and worked as a chart maker while continuing to sail on trading expeditions. During these formative years, Columbus absorbed the navigational knowledge of his time. He studied the works of classical geographers like Ptolemy and contemporary scholars like Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli. From these readings, combined with his own observations and the sailors' tales he had heard, Columbus developed a revolutionary yet fundamentally flawed theory. Columbus correctly believed the world was round, a fact actually accepted by most educated Europeans of his time. However, he drastically underestimated the Earth's circumference, calculating it to be about 18,000 miles rather than the actual 25,000. He also overestimated the eastward extent of Asia. Based on these miscalculations, Columbus concluded that Japan lay only about 3,000 miles west of Europe, making a westward voyage to Asia seem entirely feasible. Armed with this conviction, Columbus began seeking sponsorship for an exploratory voyage. He first approached King João II of Portugal in 1484, but a royal commission of experts rejected his geographical theories, correctly assessing that the distance to Asia was far greater than Columbus claimed. Undeterred, Columbus turned to Spain, where he spent nearly 7 years petitioning the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Initially, Spanish experts were similarly skeptical of Columbus's calculations. However, the political context shifted dramatically in 1492 with Spain's final victory in the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish control. With Granada captured and domestic unity achieved, Ferdinand and Isabella now looked outward, eager to extend Spanish influence and compete with Portugal in the age of exploration. In April 1492, Columbus finally received the royal sponsorship he had sought so persistently. The agreement, known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe, was remarkably generous to Columbus, naming him Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any lands he might discover, and entitling him to 10% of any treasures found. Such terms reflected both the speculative nature of the venture and Columbus's skill as a negotiator. With royal backing secured, Columbus prepared for his voyage. He obtained 3 ships, the Santa Maria, a larger Nau-type vessel which served as his flagship, and 2 smaller caravels, the Pinta and the Nina. His crew numbered about 90 men, primarily Spaniards, with a few Portuguese and Italian sailors. Many were experienced seamen, though none had ventured so far into the uncharted Atlantic. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus's small fleet departed from Palos de la Frontera in southwestern Spain. As the ships sailed past the familiar silhouette of Spanish shores and into the open Atlantic, the crews must have felt a profound mixture of excitement and apprehension. They were sailing literally off the edge of their maps into waters where European ships had never ventured. As your body continues to relax and your mind follows the path of these brave sailors, imagine the small wooden vessels making their way across the vast Atlantic, guided by nothing more than wind, stars, and the captain's conviction. The expedition's first stop was the Canary Islands, where they spent nearly a month repairing the rudder of the Pinta and taking on fresh provisions. On September 6th, they departed the islands for the final known outpost of European geography and sailed westward into the unknown. Columbus maintained 2 logbooks during the crossing, an accurate one for his own reference, and another with reduced distances to share with his crew, concerned they might lose heart if they knew how far they had truly traveled from home. As days turned into weeks, with no sight of land, anxiety grew among the crew. Contrary to popular myths, there was no serious threat of mutiny, but certainly there were grumblings and questions about turning back. Columbus persuaded his men to continue for just a few more days, promising to reconsider if they did not sight land soon. Finally, in the early morning hours of October 12th, 1492, after 36 days of sailing from the Canaries, a lookout on the Pinta spotted land. At dawn, Columbus and his crew went ashore on an island in the Bahamas, which the indigenous Taino people called Guanahani, and which Columbus renamed San Salvador, Holy Savior. Columbus believed he had reached the outlying islands of Asia, perhaps near Japan or China. He described the Taino people he encountered as peaceful and innocent, noting they wore gold ornaments that suggested wealth nearby. Communication was limited to gestures and a few words, with significant misunderstandings on both sides. The Taino initially welcomed the strange visitors, exchanging gifts and showing hospitality. Over the next 3 months, Columbus explored the islands of the Caribbean, seeking the mainland of Asia and the wealthy cities described by Marco Polo. He visited several islands in the Bahamas before discovering Cuba, which he believed might be part of mainland China. Later, he reached Hispaniola, modern Haiti and Dominican Republic, where he established a small settlement named La Navidad after the Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Eve. Leaving about 40 men at this settlement, Columbus departed for Spain in January 1493 with the 2 remaining ships. The return voyage proved more difficult than the outward journey, with storms forcing the ships to take a more northerly route. The Pinta and Nina became separated, but both eventually reached Spain, the Nina arriving at Palos on March 15th, with the Pinta following later the same day. Columbus traveled overland to Barcelona to report to Ferdinand and Isabella. His reception was triumphant. He presented the monarchs with gold ornaments, exotic plants, and several Taino people whom he had brought back, an act we recognize today as deeply problematic. The Spanish court was captivated by these tangible proofs of his discovery, though Columbus maintained he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. The apparent success of this first voyage led to 3 more expeditions under Columbus's command. His second voyage, departing in September 1493, was far larger than the first, 17 ships carrying about 1,200 men. This fleet was intended to establish permanent Spanish settlements, expand exploration, and begin the process of colonization. Arriving at Hispaniola, Columbus discovered that the La Navidad settlement had been destroyed and all the men killed, apparently after conflicts with local Taino groups. Undeterred, he established a new settlement named Isabella on the northern coast of Hispaniola and continued his explorations, discovering Jamaica and exploring more of Cuba's coastline. He remained convinced that Cuba was part of mainland Asia, even having his crew swear an oath to this effect, under threat of having their tongues cut out if they later contradicted this claim. During this second voyage, the pattern of Spanish indigenous relations darkened considerably. Columbus instituted a tribute system requiring gold from the indigenous populations, with brutal punishments for those who failed to meet quotas. Resistance was met with violence, and the Europeans brought diseases that began to devastate native populations. Columbus returned to Spain in March 1496, leaving his brothers Bartholomew and Diego in charge of the colony. His reception was less enthusiastic than after his first voyage, as reports of mismanagement and cruelty had reached the Spanish court, and the expected wealth from the new territories had not materialized. Despite these concerns, Columbus secured royal support for a third voyage, departing in May 1498 with 6 ships. This expedition took a more southerly route, leading to the discovery of Trinidad and the mainland of South America at the Paria Peninsula in modern Venezuela. Upon observing the massive outflow of fresh water from the Orinoco River, Columbus correctly surmised he had found a continent, though he still believed it was part of Asia, perhaps the biblical Garden of Eden. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola, he found the colony in disarray, with Spanish settlers rebelling against the rule of his brothers. Complaints about Columbus's governance reached Spain, leading Ferdinand and Isabella to send Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate. Upon arrival, Bobadilla arrested Columbus and his brothers and sent them back to Spain in chains in October 1500. While the monarchs released Columbus upon his arrival and expressed sympathy, they did not restore his full authority. Nevertheless, they funded a fourth and final voyage, which departed in May 1502. This expedition focused on finding a strait through what Columbus now recognized as a barrier to Asia. He explored the coasts of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, still searching for a passage to the Indian Ocean. This fourth voyage was marked by disaster. Columbus was denied entry to the colony at Hispaniola despite an approaching hurricane he had predicted. Several ships in the official fleet were lost in the storm, while Columbus's ships survived. Later, his vessels were damaged by shipworms, forcing him and his crew to be stranded on Jamaica for a year before rescue finally arrived. Columbus returned to Spain in November 1540, his health failing and his reputation diminished. As you continue to drift peacefully with the historical currents, consider the profound irony of Columbus's achievements. He had set out to find a western route to Asia, but instead stumbled upon an entirely different hemisphere, a new world whose existence Europeans had never suspected. Yet to his dying day, Columbus maintained he had reached Asia, unable to recognize the true significance of what he had found. Columbus spent his final years in Spain, engaged in legal battles with the crown over the rights and revenues promised in his original contract. He died in Valladolid on May 20th, 1560, with his convictions intact, but his true accomplishment still not fully understood. The historical significance of Columbus's voyages cannot be overstated. Within a few years of his first landing, Europeans began to grasp that what Columbus had found was not Asia, but continents previously unknown to them. The term New World came into use, and detailed exploration revealed the true extent of the Americas. For Spain, Columbus's discoveries launched an era of conquest and colonization that would make it the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe for generations. The gold and silver of the Americas funded Spanish ambitions in Europe and beyond, reshaping global power dynamics. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the consequences were devastating. European diseases against which they had no immunity swept through populations, causing demographic collapse. Military conquest, enslavement, and cultural disruption followed, forever altering the trajectory of American civilizations. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, people, diseases, and ideas between hemispheres, transformed ecosystems and societies worldwide. European crops like wheat were introduced to the Americas, while American crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes revolutionized diets and agricultural systems in Europe, Africa, and Asia. This biological exchange represents one of the most significant ecological events in Earth's history. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider the complexity of Columbus's legacy. He was a skilled navigator whose courage and determination led to one of history's pivotal moments. Yet he was also a man of his time, whose actions initiated centuries of colonization with devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. His voyages can be seen simultaneously as a triumph of human exploration and the beginning of a tragic chapter in human interactions. The man himself remains an enigma, brilliant yet flawed, visionary yet blind to the true nature of his discovery, achieving immortal fame for finding something he never sought and never recognized. As you settle into deeper relaxation, let the paradoxes of Columbus's story remind us of the inherent complexity of history and human achievement. In our next chapter, we will explore how Europeans gradually came to understand that Columbus had actually discovered a new continent through the voyages and writings of Amerigo Vespucci. But for now, let the gentle rocking of those three small ships on the vast Atlantic, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, carry you toward peaceful slumber and dreams of discovery. As you settle more deeply into relaxation, we continue our journey through the age of exploration to discover how Europeans gradually came to understand the true nature of Columbus's discoveries. While Columbus insisted until his death that he had reached Asia, another explorer would provide the crucial insights that revealed the existence of an entirely new continent. Amerigo Vespucci was born in Florence, Italy, in March 1454, 9 years after the end of the Middle Ages. Unlike Columbus, who came from humble origins, Vespucci was born into a prominent merchant family with connections to the powerful Medici dynasty that ruled Florence. This privileged background provided him with an excellent education in the humanities, mathematics, astronomy, and geography, subjects that would later prove invaluable in his explorations. In his early career, Vespucci worked for the Medici banking house, developing expertise in commercial matters. This work eventually took him to Seville, Spain, in 1492, the same year Columbus embarked on his first voyage. In Seville, Vespucci became involved in fitting out ships for Atlantic voyages, including possibly some of Columbus's later expeditions. This experience gave him first-hand knowledge of the practical aspects of oceanic exploration. As news of Columbus's discoveries spread throughout Europe, Vespucci became increasingly fascinated by the newly found lands. Like many educated Europeans, he was skeptical of Columbus's claim to have reached Asia. The descriptions of the lands, peoples, flora, and fauna simply did not match the existing accounts of East Asia from travelers like Marco Polo. Between 1497 and 1504, Vespucci participated in at least 2 voyages across the Atlantic, though the exact details remain subjects of historical debate. His first confirmed voyage began in May 1499, when he sailed under the Spanish flag as part of an expedition commanded by Alonso de Ojeda. This fleet explored the northern coast of South America, including the mouths of the Amazon and Orinoco rivers. During this voyage, Vespucci was struck by the immensity of the landmass they were exploring. The enormous outflow of fresh water from the Amazon suggested a continent of unprecedented size. The diversity of peoples, languages, and customs encountered bore little resemblance to Asian civilizations known to Europeans. The flora and fauna were entirely unfamiliar. These observations led Vespucci to a revolutionary conclusion. They were exploring not the eastern edges of Asia, but an entirely new world, unknown to ancient geographers. In 1501, Vespucci embarked on his most significant voyage, this time under Portuguese sponsorship. While the exact route is debated by historians, this expedition explored the eastern coast of South America, venturing far to the south along what is now Brazil. Some accounts suggest they may have sailed as far as the Rio de la Plata, near modern day Buenos Aires, or possibly even further south. This journey provided Vespucci with an even clearer perspective on the extent of the newly discovered lands. The coastline continued southward for thousands of miles with no sign of a passage to Asia. If this were merely an island off the Asian coast, as Columbus had believed, it would be of unprecedented size. Furthermore, the people, animals, and plants continued to differ dramatically from any Asian descriptions. As you continue to relax and your thoughts float gently with these historical currents, imagine Vespucci standing on the deck of his ship, gazing at the coastline of an unknown continent stretching endlessly before him, gradually comprehending the magnitude of what Europeans had discovered. What distinguished Vespucci from other explorers of his time was not just his voyages themselves, but his brilliant analysis of their significance. Upon returning to Europe, he wrote a series of letters describing his observations and conclusions. The most famous of these, Mundus Novus, A New World, was published around 1502 or 1503 and became an instant sensation across Europe. In this letter, Vespucci explicitly argued that the lands being explored were not part of Asia, but constituted a previously unknown continent. He wrote, "Those new regions, which we found and explored with the fleet, we may rightly call a new world." This revolutionary idea challenged not only Columbus's interpretation, but the entire medieval European geographical understanding based on classical authorities. Vespucci's ideas gained further circulation through another publication, Quatuor Navigationes, Four Voyages, which appeared around 1550 or 1560. This work described 4 voyages allegedly made by Vespucci, though historians now believe that some details were embellished or invented by the publisher to create a more dramatic narrative. These publications reached Martin Waldseemüller, a German cartographer working on an updated world map. In 1507, Waldseemüller published his groundbreaking map, which depicted the newly discovered lands as a separate continent. In honor of Amerigo Vespucci, whom he credited with the discovery, Waldseemüller labeled this continent America, the feminine Latin form of Amerigo. Initially, the name America was applied only to the southern continent we now call South America. North America was still depicted as connected to Asia or as a separate landmass with an uncertain relationship to Asia. It would take several more decades of exploration to establish the full extent of the American continents and their complete separation from Asia. The naming of the continent after Vespucci rather than Columbus has sometimes been viewed as a historical injustice. However, it reflects the crucial conceptual difference between the two explorers. Columbus physically discovered the Americas, but misunderstood what he had found. Vespucci, though not the first European to reach the Americas, was among the first to correctly recognize them as a previously unknown continent, separate from Asia, a genuinely new world. In 1508, the skills and knowledge Vespucci had demonstrated led to his appointment as Spain's pilot major, a position of considerable importance. In this role, he was responsible for training pilots, examining navigational charts, and standardizing navigational techniques for Spanish voyages. He held this position until his death in 1512, contributing significantly to Spain's maritime supremacy during the early age of exploration. Vespucci's recognition of the Americas as a separate continent represented a profound conceptual shift in European understanding of world geography. The medieval worldview, inherited from ancient authorities and centered on the three known continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia, had to be fundamentally reconsidered. The implications of this recognition were immense and multifaceted. Politically, it raised new questions about how these lands would be divided among European powers. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had already attempted to divide the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, but this agreement was based on the assumption that Columbus had reached Asia. The recognition of an entirely new continent complicated these arrangements. Intellectually, the discovery challenged the authority of ancient knowledge. If the classical geographers had been unaware of entire continents, what other aspects of their understanding might be incomplete or incorrect? This question contributed to the growing empirical spirit of the Renaissance and early modern period, the idea that direct observation and experience might be more reliable than ancient authorities. Economically, the recognition of the Americas as a separate continent prompted a reevaluation of their potential value. If these were not the spice-rich lands of Asia, what resources might they offer instead? The subsequent decades would reveal the vast mineral wealth of the Americas, particularly the silver of Mexico and Peru, which would transform the European and global economy. For indigenous American peoples, the European recognition of their continents as a new world had profound and often devastating consequences. The conceptual separation of the Americas from Asia contributed to the view of indigenous peoples as fundamentally different from other known populations, facilitating their dehumanization and the justification of conquest and colonization. As your body grows heavier and your mind continues to drift, consider how the intellectual recognition of the Americas as a separate continent was as significant in its way as the physical act of crossing the Atlantic. Ideas shape how we perceive and interact with the world, and Vespucci's insight fundamentally altered the European worldview. Unlike Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci has not become a major figure in popular historical consciousness. He led no conquests, founded no colonies, and governed no territories. His contribution was primarily intellectual, the recognition and articulation of the true nature of the European discoveries in the Western Atlantic. Yet this conceptual breakthrough was crucial in shaping how Europeans understood and approached the new lands they had encountered. The legacy of Vespucci lives on most obviously in the name of our continent, America. Each time we speak this name, we unconsciously honor the Florentine merchant and explorer whose insight helped Europeans comprehend the true magnitude of their discoveries. Beyond this nominal recognition, Vespucci's contribution represents the essential role of interpretation and understanding in human discovery. It is not enough merely to see something new. We must comprehend what we are seeing for discovery to have its full significance. In the decades following Vespucci's voyages, European exploration of the Americas accelerated dramatically. Spanish conquistadors penetrated the interiors of Mexico, Peru, and other regions, encountering the advanced civilizations of the Aztecs and Incas. Portuguese colonizers established plantations along the Brazilian coast. French and English explorers began to investigate the northern reaches of the continent. As European understanding of the Americas evolved, so too did the maps that represented them. The crude outlines on early 16th century maps gradually gave way to more accurate depictions as navigators carefully charted coastlines and explorers mapped interior regions. By 1540, the general shape of South America was relatively well understood, while North America remained more mysterious, particularly in its northwestern portions. The search for a passage through or around the Americas to reach Asia continued to motivate exploration throughout the 16th century and beyond. The Pacific Ocean, first sighted by European eyes when Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, presented both a barrier and an opportunity. Its vastness, gradually revealed through subsequent explorations, emphasized how far Asia truly was from Europe via a western route. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the growing realization among European cartographers, merchants, and monarchs that Columbus had not found a shortcut to Asia, but had instead stumbled upon an entirely new hemisphere, a reality that would transform their understanding of the world and their place within it. In our next chapter, we will explore one of the greatest achievements of the age of exploration, the first circumnavigation of the globe led by Ferdinand Magellan. But for now, let the gentle waves of historical discovery carry you toward peaceful slumber as the outlines of continents once unknown gradually take shape in the atlas of human knowledge. As your mind continues to drift peacefully through the currents of history, we arrive at one of the most extraordinary achievements of the age of exploration, the first circumnavigation of the globe. This remarkable journey would conclusively demonstrate the spherical nature of the Earth and reveal the true vastness of our planet. Ferdinand Magellan was born into a noble Portuguese family around 1480 in northern Portugal. Orphaned at a young age, he became a page at the royal court, where he received education in the subjects essential for a gentleman of his time: cartography, astronomy, navigation, and the art of war. These skills would later prove crucial for his historic voyage. As a young man, Magellan gained valuable experience sailing with Portuguese fleets to India, Malacca, and the Spice Islands. He participated in various military campaigns and trading missions, developing an intimate knowledge of oceanic navigation and the lucrative spice trade. During these early voyages, Magellan likely heard sailors' tales of lands south of the known Spice Islands, stories that would later influence his plans. Despite his service to Portugal, Magellan fell out of favor with King Manuel I after being accused of illegal trading and refusing to return to service when summoned. Finding his career prospects blocked in his homeland, Magellan followed the example of Columbus and turned to Spain, Portugal's chief rival in exploration. In 1518, Magellan presented an ambitious proposal to the young King Charles I of Spain, later Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Magellan claimed he could find a western route to the Spice Islands by discovering a strait through the Americas. This passage, he argued, would place the valuable Spice Islands within Spain's half of the globe, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which had divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal. The Spanish monarch, eager to challenge Portugal's dominance in the spice trade, agreed to sponsor Magellan's expedition. The enterprise was organized as a commercial venture, with the Crown and private investors sharing the costs and anticipated profits. Magellan was named Captain General of the fleet and granted various privileges and rights to future discoveries. On September 20th, 1519, Magellan's fleet departed from Sanlúcar de Barrameda with 5 ships: the Trinidad, flagship, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. The crew of approximately 270 men was remarkably international, including Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, French, English, and even Southeast Asians who had previously traveled to Europe. As these wooden vessels sailed into the open Atlantic, their crews faced a journey of unprecedented scope and danger. Magellan, as the expedition leader, carried the immense responsibility of guiding his men safely through unknown waters while maintaining discipline and morale. The fleet first crossed the Atlantic to South America, reaching the coast of modern-day Brazil in December. They spent several months exploring the coastline southward, searching for the elusive passage to the Pacific. As they ventured further south, the weather grew increasingly harsh, and the tall tales of earlier explorers, stories of giants and monsters, created anxiety among the crew. By March 15th, 2020, with the southern hemisphere autumn approaching and conditions deteriorating, Magellan decided to winter in a natural harbor he named Puerto San Julian on the Patagonian coast. This enforced stay of nearly 5 months tested the expedition severely. Food was rationed, the cold was bitter, and discontent grew among the largely idle crew. In April, 3 of the 5 ship captains, all Spaniards resentful of serving under a Portuguese commander, attempted a mutiny. Magellan acted decisively and ruthlessly. One rebellious captain was killed in a confrontation, another executed after a brief trial, and the third confined in chains. This forceful response quelled the rebellion, but tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface. During this winter layover, contact was made with local indigenous people whom the Europeans called Patagonians, supposedly because of their large feet, Patagon meaning big foot in Spanish. Despite initial peaceful exchanges, relations soured and several confrontations occurred. These encounters added to the sense of having reached a truly alien world. With the arrival of spring in the southern hemisphere, the expedition resumed its journey in October 1520. Tragically, one ship, the Santiago, had been lost in an exploratory mission months earlier, leaving 4 vessels to continue the search for a passage. On October 21st, the fleet finally discovered what they had been seeking: a strait leading westward through the southern tip of South America. Today, we know this as the Strait of Magellan, a treacherous, winding passage about 350 miles long. For 38 days, the fleet navigated this challenging waterway with its unpredictable currents, narrow channels, and frequent storms. During this passage, the San Antonio, carrying much of the expedition's supplies, deserted and returned to Spain. Its captain, Esteban Gomez, had never forgiven Magellan for being passed over for leadership of the expedition. This desertion reduced the fleet to just 3 ships and created serious supply shortages for the remainder of the journey. On November 28th, 1520, the remaining vessels emerged from the strait into a vast ocean. Magellan named it the Pacific, Peaceful Sea, impressed by its apparent calm after the turbulent waters of the strait. Little did he know that this ocean covered nearly one-third of the Earth's surface, and crossing it would be the most arduous part of the journey. The Pacific crossing proved to be a nightmare beyond anything the crew had imagined. Magellan had severely underestimated the size of this ocean. What he anticipated would be a journey of a few weeks stretched into a grueling 3-month ordeal. The ship sailed through an apparently endless expanse of water, encountering only two small, uninhabited islands that offered no provisions. As supplies dwindled, the men resorted to eating rats, sawdust mixed with ship's biscuit, and even the leather fittings of the rigging soaked in seawater. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, ravaged the crew. Gums swelled until teeth fell out, wounds refused to heal, and men died in agony. By the end of the crossing, at least 19 men had perished. As your body continues to relax deeply, imagine those wooden ships sailing day after day through the vast Pacific, the horizon unchanging, the sun relentless, and the men praying for sight of land as their suffering intensified. Finally, on March 6th, 1521, after 98 days at sea, the fleet reached Guam in the Mariana Islands. Here they obtained desperately needed fresh food and water before continuing westward. On March 16th, they reached the island of Homenhon in what is now the Philippines. Magellan and his crew were the first Europeans to reach the Philippines from the east. Here, Magellan's prior experience in Southeast Asia proved valuable. He was able to communicate through his Malay interpreter, Enrique, who could understand the local languages. This has led some historians to suggest that Enrique, who had been enslaved in Malacca and purchased by Magellan years earlier, may have been the first person to linguistically circumnavigate the globe, returning to a region where his native language was understood. In the Philippines, Magellan became involved in local politics, forming an alliance with Raja Humabon of Cebu, who converted to Christianity, along with many of his subjects. This alliance proved fatal when Magellan agreed to help Humabon fight against Lapu-Lapu, a chief on the nearby island of Mactan who refused to recognize Spanish authority. On April 27th, 1521, Magellan led a small force to Mactan. Overconfident in European military superiority, he underestimated the local warriors. In the ensuing battle, Magellan was killed, along with several of his men. His body was never recovered. With Magellan's death, the expedition lost its visionary leader. Juan Sebastian Elcano, a Spanish navigator who had ironically participated in the earlier mutiny, took command of the Victoria, while Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa commanded the Trinidad. The remaining crew, now too few to man 3 ships, abandoned and burned the Concepcion. The 2 remaining vessels reached the Spice Islands, Moluccas, in November 1521, finally achieving the expedition's commercial objective. They loaded their holds with valuable cloves and considered the route home. The Trinidad, needing repairs, attempted to return across the Pacific to Spanish America, but was captured by the Portuguese. The Victoria, under Elcano's command, chose to continue westward, completing the global circumnavigation. This final leg of the journey was another immense challenge. The Victoria sailed across the Indian Ocean, around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, and up the western African coast with minimal stops, fearing Portuguese capture. Scurvy again took a toll, and the ship was in poor condition, requiring constant pumping to remain afloat. On September 6th, 1522, nearly 3 years after departure, the Victoria returned to Spain with just 18 of the original crew. They were the first humans known to have circumnavigated the globe. Juan Sebastian Elcano received great honors from King Charles, including a coat of arms bearing the motto, "You were the first to encircle me," and a substantial pension. The survivors' accounts of the voyage, particularly the detailed journal kept by Antonio Pigafetta, provided Europeans with valuable new information about the world's geography. The significance of the Magellan Elcano expedition extends far beyond the remarkable feat of circumnavigation. It empirically demonstrated that the Earth was indeed a sphere, provided a much more accurate understanding of the planet's size, and revealed the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It established that the Americas were separated from Asia by an enormous ocean, definitively disproving Columbus's belief that he had reached Asia. For Spain, the expedition opened a new route to the east, though the tremendous distance made the western path to the Spice Islands commercially impractical compared to Portugal's eastern route around Africa. Nevertheless, this voyage laid the groundwork for the Manila galleon trade that would connect Spanish America with the Philippines for 2.5 centuries. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider the extraordinary courage and endurance shown by Magellan and his crew. They ventured into the truly unknown, suffered unimaginable hardships, and achieved what no one had done before, completing a journey around the entire world. In our next chapter, we will explore how Spanish conquistadors penetrated the American continents, encountering advanced civilizations and forever changing the course of history. But for now, let the gentle rocking of Magellan's ships on the vast Pacific and the triumph of the Victoria's return carry you toward peaceful slumber, wrapped in the knowledge of our round world and its once unimaginable vastness. As your mind continues its peaceful journey through history, we now turn to one of the most dramatic chapters in the age of exploration, the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Following Columbus's initial voyages, a remarkable series of expeditions led by ambitious men known as conquistadors would penetrate deep into the American continents, encountering advanced civilizations and forever altering the course of history. The word conquistador comes from the Spanish verb conquistar, meaning to conquer. These men were not formal representatives of the Spanish crown, but rather private adventurers operating under royal authority. They financed their own expeditions, motivated by dreams of wealth, glory, and religious zeal. Their backgrounds were diverse. Some were noblemen seeking to restore family fortunes, others were commoners hoping to rise in station, and many were veterans of European conflicts seeking new opportunities. The first major conquest began in 1519 when Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with approximately 600 men, 16 horses, and a few small cannons. Born in 1585 to a family of minor nobility in Extremadura, Spain, Cortés had already spent several years in the Caribbean colony of Hispaniola and later Cuba, where he had become a prosperous landowner. Ambitious and restless, he secured permission from the governor of Cuba to lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland, where previous explorers had reported wealthy civilizations. Upon arriving on the Mexican coast, Cortés made a decisive and symbolic gesture. He ordered his ships scuttled, eliminating the possibility of retreat and committing his men to the conquest ahead. This bold action demonstrated the confidence and determination that characterized the conquistadors at their most effective. As you continue to relax, imagine these Spanish adventurers making their way inland, encountering a world entirely unfamiliar to European experience, with their futures hanging in the balance of each decision. Cortés's expedition soon encountered the Tlaxcalans, traditional enemies of the Aztec Empire. After initial battles, Cortés managed to form an alliance with the Tlaxcalans, who saw in the Spanish a potential means to overthrow Aztec dominance. This pattern of exploiting local rivalries and conflicts would prove crucial to Spanish success throughout the Americas, allowing small groups of conquistadors to topple much larger indigenous powers. In November 1519, Cortés and his men, now accompanied by thousands of indigenous allies, reached Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco with grand temples, palaces, and canals, Tenochtitlan was one of the world's largest cities, with a population estimated at 200,000, larger than any European city of the time. The Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II, received the Spanish peacefully, possibly influenced by legends that predicted the return of a light-skinned god named Quetzalcoatl. This initial welcome allowed Cortés to enter the heart of the empire and observe its wealth and organization. However, the peaceful situation deteriorated when Cortés took Moctezuma hostage in response to an attack on Spaniards at the coast. In June 1520, during Cortés's temporary absence from Tenochtitlan, his lieutenant Alvarado massacred Aztec nobles during a religious festival, triggering a massive uprising. The Spanish and their allies were forced to flee the city in what became known as La Noche Triste, the sad night, suffering heavy casualties. Rather than conceding defeat, Cortés regrouped, gathered more indigenous allies, and returned to besiege Tenochtitlan. After months of fighting, and with the devastating assistance of smallpox that had begun to ravage the Aztec population, the Spanish and their allies captured and destroyed the great city in August 1521. On its ruins, they would build Mexico City, the capital of New Spain. Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire demonstrated how a small force with superior technology, effective diplomacy, and the unintentional biological weapon of disease could overcome a powerful indigenous state. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the Americas in the decades that followed. While Cortés was conquering Mexico, other Spanish expeditions were exploring different regions of the Americas. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa had crossed the Isthmus of Panama and become the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the American continent. This momentous discovery confirmed that the Americas were indeed a separate landmass, not connected to Asia. Between 1519 and 1522, Pánfilo de Narváez explored parts of Florida, though with little success. Later, between 1528 and 1536, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca led a remarkable 8-year journey across what is now the southern United States and northern Mexico after his expedition was shipwrecked on the Texas coast. His account of this journey, published in 1542, provided Europe with some of the earliest information about the interior of North America. As your body continues to grow heavier and your thoughts drift with these historical currents, we turn to another momentous conquest, the Spanish overthrow of the Inca Empire in South America. Francisco Pizarro, like Cortes, was born in Extremadura, Spain, to a family of minor nobility. After years of service in the Caribbean and Panama, he became intrigued by reports of a wealthy empire to the south. Between 1524 and 1527, he led two exploratory expeditions along the Pacific coast of South America, gaining tantalizing glimpses of the Inca civilization. In 1532, after securing royal authorization from Emperor Charles V, Pizarro set out with a force of about 160 men and a few dozen horses to conquer the Inca Empire, a sophisticated civilization spanning much of western South America, connected by an impressive network of roads and ruled by an emperor considered divine by his people. Pizarro's timing proved fortuitous. The Inca Empire had recently suffered through a civil war between two brothers competing for the throne, and a devastating smallpox epidemic had killed many Incas, including the previous emperor. The new emperor, Atahualpa, was still consolidating his power when the Spanish arrived. In November 1532, through clever diplomacy, Pizarro arranged a meeting with Atahualpa in the city of Cajamarca. When the emperor arrived with thousands of attendants, but only lightly armed guards, Pizarro sprung a trap. The Spanish, hiding in buildings around the central plaza, launched a surprise attack. Using cavalry, steel weapons, and the shock of gunpowder, they killed thousands of Atahualpa's followers and captured the emperor himself. In an attempt to secure his freedom, Atahualpa offered an astonishing ransom, a room filled with gold and silver. The Spanish accepted, and for months, treasures flowed into Cajamarca from across the empire. Despite fulfilling his promise, Atahualpa was not released. Instead, after a show trial, he was executed in July 1533. With the emperor dead and the imperial succession in chaos, Pizarro marched on Cusco, the Inca capital, capturing it with relative ease. Though Inca resistance would continue for decades in various forms, the conquest of the empire's core was remarkably swift. Like Cortes in Mexico, Pizarro had toppled a powerful indigenous civilization with a tiny force, exploiting local divisions, technological advantages, and the devastating impact of European diseases. Following these major conquests, Spanish exploration and colonization expanded rapidly across the Americas. In South America, as expeditions pushed southward into Chile under Diego de Almagro and Pedro de Valdivia, eastward into the Amazon basin with Gonzalo Pizarro and Francisco de Orellana, and northward into Colombia with Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. In North America, Hernando de Soto led a major expedition through the southeastern United States between 1539 and 1542, becoming the first European to cross the Mississippi River. Almost simultaneously, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado explored the southwestern United States, searching for the fabled Seven Cities of Cibola, a legend of golden cities that proved as elusive as El Dorado, the mythical city of gold that inspired many fruitless expeditions in South America. These explorers were driven by a complex mixture of motivations. The desire for wealth was paramount. The spectacular success of Cortes and Pizarro inspired others to seek similar fortunes. Religious zeal was also significant. Many conquistadors genuinely believed they were spreading Christianity and saving souls, even as their methods contradicted Christian principles of compassion and mercy. Imperial glory, personal ambition, and simple curiosity about what lay beyond the next mountain range all played their part in driving these remarkable journeys. The world they encountered was far more complex and diverse than Europeans had initially imagined. The Americas contained not just the advanced civilizations of the Aztecs and Incas, but thousands of distinct cultures with their own languages, beliefs, and ways of life. Some were sophisticated urban societies, others were agricultural communities, and still others were hunter gatherers. This incredible human diversity matched the natural diversity of the American continents with their varied ecosystems from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the arrival of the conquistadors was apocalyptic. Beyond the direct violence of conquest, European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated populations with no natural immunity. Some regions experienced population declines of 90% or more within a century of European contact. This demographic collapse represents one of the most significant catastrophes in human history. The conquistadors and those who followed them transformed the Americas in fundamental ways. They established new cities, introduced European plants and animals, imposed Christianity, and integrated the continents into global trade networks. The gold and silver they seized and mined fueled the Spanish Empire and transformed the European economy. The colonial societies they established would eventually evolve into the modern nations of Latin America, carrying the complex legacy of conquest into the present day. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider how these few decades of exploration and conquest in the early 16th century reshaped the human world. Small groups of adventurers, operating at the very edges of their known world, connected continents and cultures that had developed independently for thousands of years. Their actions set in motion processes of exchange, conflict, and transformation that continue to this day. In our next chapter, we will explore how other European powers, England, France, and the Netherlands, joined the age of exploration, challenging Spanish and Portuguese dominance and extending European discovery to new regions. But for now, let the fading echoes of this momentous era of encounter and conquest guide you toward peaceful slumber as the waves of history continue to carry us through the great age of discovery. As your mind continues its peaceful journey through the age of exploration, we now turn to how other European powers joined this remarkable era of discovery. While Spain and Portugal initially dominated overseas exploration, by the late 16th century, new contenders, England, France, and the Netherlands, were increasingly asserting themselves on the world stage, bringing fresh perspectives and objectives to the ongoing process of global exploration. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had attempted to divide the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, but other European nations had little reason to respect an agreement to which they were not party. As awareness of the wealth flowing from new lands spread, these nations sought their own routes to prosperity and power through exploration and trade. England's entry into serious overseas exploration began during the reign of Henry VII. In May 1497, just 5 years after Columbus's first voyage, the Venetian navigator John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, set sail from Bristol under English patronage. His small ship, the Matthew, with a crew of just 18 men, crossed the North Atlantic and made landfall somewhere on the coast of North America, possibly Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, or Maine. This voyage established England's claim to portions of North America and initiated English interest in the rich fishing grounds off Newfoundland. Cabot's second voyage in 1498 ended in disaster when his ship was lost at sea, but his son Sebastian continued his father's exploratory work, sailing along the east coast of North America and perhaps as far south as the Caribbean. Despite these early voyages, English exploration languished for several decades as the nation was preoccupied with domestic affairs, particularly the religious and political upheavals of the Tudor period. It was not until the reign of Elizabeth I in the latter half of the 16th century that England emerged as a significant maritime power with global ambitions. The Elizabethan era of exploration was characterized by a combination of trading initiatives, privateering, state sanctioned piracy against Spanish and Portuguese shipping, and attempts to find new routes to Asia. One of the era's most prominent figures was Sir Francis Drake, who between 1577 and 1580 conducted the second circumnavigation of the globe, claiming California for England and capturing tremendous Spanish treasures along the way. Another Elizabethan explorer, Martin Frobisher, conducted 3 voyages between 1576 and 1578 in search of the Northwest Passage, a hypothetical sea route through or around northern North America connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Though he failed to find this elusive passage, Frobisher explored parts of what is now northern Canada and Greenland. As you continue to relax and your thoughts drift with these historical voyages, imagine these small wooden ships navigating the frigid, iceberg-filled waters of the North Atlantic, their crews huddled against the cold, searching for a pathway that would not be successfully traversed until the early 20th century. Sir Humphrey Gilbert and his half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, were granted permission by Queen Elizabeth to establish England's first colonies in North America. Gilbert's 1583 attempt to settle Newfoundland ended in disaster when he was lost at sea during the return voyage. Raleigh's subsequent efforts to establish a colony at Roanoke Island in present-day North Carolina in 1585 and 1587 also failed, with the second colony mysteriously disappearing, becoming known to history as the Lost Colony. Despite these setbacks, the foundation had been laid for future English colonization in North America. In 1607, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas was established at Jamestown, Virginia, beginning the process that would eventually lead to the formation of the United States. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, France was also developing ambitions for exploration and colonization. French interest in the New World was initially focused on the rich fishing grounds off Newfoundland, which French fishermen began exploiting early in the 16th century. The first documented French exploration of North America came with the voyages of Giovanni da Verrazzano, an Italian navigator sailing under the French flag. In 1524, Verrazzano explored the eastern seaboard of North America, from Florida to Newfoundland, providing France with its first detailed information about these territories. His reports of an inland passage to the Pacific proved incorrect, but influenced later French exploration. The most significant early French explorer was Jacques Cartier, who conducted 3 voyages to what is now Canada between 1534 and 1542. Cartier explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence and sailed up the St. Lawrence River as far as present-day Montreal, claiming these lands for France. He was the first European to describe and map the region, naming it Canada after the Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. Despite Cartier's efforts, permanent French settlement in North America did not begin until the early 17th century. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain established Quebec, the first successful French colony in the Americas and the cornerstone of New France. Champlain was a remarkable figure, explorer, diplomat, and administrator who personally mapped much of northeastern North America and worked to establish peaceful relations with indigenous peoples. As your body grows heavier and your mind continues to float with these historical currents, let us turn to the Netherlands, whose entry into global exploration came later but quickly proved significant. The Dutch emerged as a major exploratory power in the early 17th century, following their independence from Spanish rule. Unlike Spain and Portugal, whose overseas ventures were closely directed by their monarchs, Dutch exploration was primarily organized by commercial enterprises, particularly the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, and the Dutch West India Company, established in 1621. These companies combined private investment with state support, creating a powerful model for commercial expansion. The VOC, in particular, quickly became one of the world's most powerful corporations, with the authority to establish colonies, maintain armed forces, and negotiate treaties with foreign powers. Dutch exploration focused primarily on establishing profitable trade routes rather than territorial conquest or religious conversion. Their navigators mapped coastlines with remarkable accuracy, creating charts that would be used by sailors of all nations for generations. One of the most notable Dutch explorers was Willem Barents, who conducted 3 expeditions to the Arctic between 1594 and 1597, searching for the Northeast Passage, a potential route to Asia across the top of Europe and Russia. Though he failed to find this passage and perished during the 3rd expedition, Barents's voyages significantly enhanced European knowledge of the Arctic. In 1609, Henry Hudson, an English navigator employed by the Dutch East India Company, explored the river that now bears his name, laying the groundwork for Dutch claims to the region that would become New Netherland, including the settlement of New Amsterdam, or later New York. Further afield, Dutch explorers were active in the waters around South America, Africa, and Asia. In 1615, Willem Schouten and Jacob Lemaire became the first to navigate around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, discovering an alternative route to the Pacific that avoided the Strait of Magellan, which was claimed by Spain. Perhaps the most significant Dutch contribution to Pacific exploration came with the voyages of Abel Tasman. Between 1642 and 1644, Tasman explored the southern hemisphere, becoming the first European to reach Tasmania, which he named Van Diemen's Land after his patron, and New Zealand. Significantly, Tasman's voyages proved that Australia was not connected to a hypothetical southern continent, though the complete circumnavigation of Australia would not be accomplished until Captain James Cook's voyage more than a century later. As these 3 maritime powers, England, France, and the Netherlands, extended their exploratory reach, They brought distinctive national styles and objectives to the ongoing process of global discovery. The English combined trading ventures with privateering against Spanish shipping and attempts to find alternative routes to Asia. The French focused on the fur trade and establishing alliances with indigenous peoples, particularly in North America. The Dutch prioritized commercial networks over territorial conquest, establishing strategic trading posts rather than large colonies. These different approaches reflected distinct national circumstances and priorities. England, an island nation with naval traditions, saw overseas ventures as an extension of its maritime identity and a means to challenge Spanish power. France, a continental power with a centralized monarchy, approached colonization with greater state direction. The Dutch, emerging from their struggle against Spanish rule, viewed global commerce as an extension of their commercial and republican values. Despite their differences, these three powers shared certain common features in their exploratory efforts. All were Protestant nations, with the partial exception of France, which added a religious dimension to their competition with Catholic Spain and Portugal. All three were developing more capitalistic economic systems, with private investment playing a significant role in funding exploration. And all three were evolving more representative political institutions, at least for certain classes of citizens, creating different dynamics between rulers and ruled than in the more absolutist Iberian kingdoms. As these new powers entered the global stage, the nature of exploration began to change. The heroic age of geographic discovery was gradually giving way to a more systematic mapping of the world. Scientific objectives began to complement commercial and strategic goals. The 18th century would see explorers like James Cook undertaking voyages explicitly designed to collect scientific data alongside their cartographic and imperial missions. For indigenous peoples worldwide, the entry of these new European powers meant both new threats and sometimes new opportunities. Different colonial powers often pursued different policies toward native populations, sometimes creating space for indigenous groups to play rivals against each other. However, the overall process of European expansion continued to bring disease, displacement, and cultural disruption to peoples across the globe. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider how the world was becoming increasingly interconnected through these voyages of exploration. Information, goods, plants, animals, and people were flowing across oceanic barriers that had previously limited such exchanges. A truly global system of trade and communication was emerging, fundamentally changing human societies on every continent. The legacy of this second wave of European exploration continues to shape our world. The languages, legal systems, and cultural patterns established by English, French, and Dutch explorers and colonizers remain influential across vast regions. The colonial territories they established would eventually become independent nations, carrying complex mixtures of European and indigenous influences into the modern era. In our final chapter, we will explore the lasting legacy of the age of exploration, how these remarkable voyages transformed human understanding of the world and laid the foundations of our modern global civilization. But for now, let the gentle motion of those exploring ships on distant seas carry you toward peaceful slumber as the waves of history continue to shape the shores of human experience. As your mind drifts peacefully through the currents of history, we arrive at our final chapter where we will explore the profound and lasting legacy of the Age of Exploration. These remarkable voyages of discovery, spanning roughly from the mid 15th to the early 17th century, transformed human understanding of the world and set in motion processes that continue to shape our global civilization today. Perhaps the most immediate impact of the great geographical discoveries was the revolution in European understanding of world geography. The medieval European worldview, inherited from classical authorities and centered on the three known continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia, had to be fundamentally reconsidered. Maps drawn before and after this period reveal the dramatic expansion of European geographical knowledge, from vague, often fanciful depictions of distant lands to increasingly accurate representations of global geography. This cartographic revolution was both practical and philosophical. On the practical side, more accurate charts and maps facilitated navigation, trade, and colonial administration. On the philosophical side, the discovery of entirely unknown continents, peoples, and species challenged European assumptions about the completeness of ancient knowledge and encouraged a more empirical approach to understanding the world, an intellectual shift that would contribute to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. As you continue to relax and your body grows heavier, consider how the mental maps we all carry within us shape our understanding of our place in the world, just as the expanding maps of the explorers reshaped European consciousness. Among the most significant consequences of the Age of Exploration was the creation of the first truly global trade networks. Before this period, trade had operated primarily within regional systems. The Mediterranean world, the Indian Ocean network, the Silk Road connecting East Asia and Europe, and various smaller regional exchanges. These networks had some connections to each other, but goods typically passed through multiple intermediaries when moving between regions. The voyages of discovery established direct maritime connections between these previously separate trading worlds. Portuguese ships now linked Europe directly to the markets of India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China and Japan. Spanish galleons crossed the Pacific, connecting the Americas to Asia. European vessels began to dominate the world's oceans, creating new patterns of trade and exchange that bypassed the older land routes and their intermediaries. This emerging global trade had profound economic consequences. New sources of precious metals, particularly silver from the Americas, increased the global money supply and stimulated commercial activity. The volume and variety of goods in international trade expanded dramatically. Prices and wages were affected across continents as local economies became increasingly integrated into global markets. The period witnessed shifts in the economic center of gravity within Europe. The traditional Mediterranean powers, Venice, Genoa, and the Italian city-states, declined in relative importance as Atlantic nations like Portugal, Spain, and later the Netherlands and England rose to commercial prominence. Cities like Lisbon, Seville, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London grew wealthy from overseas trade, processing, and distributing goods from around the world. Equally profound was the biological exchange triggered by these new global connections. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and even agricultural techniques between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. This biological redistribution represents one of the most significant ecological events in Earth's history. From the Americas to the Old World came crops like maize, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, cacao, and tobacco. These American crops would eventually transform diets and agricultural systems across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The potato, in particular, became a staple food in much of Northern Europe, supporting population growth and changing farming practices. In the other direction, Europeans introduced wheat, rice, sugarcane, coffee, bananas, citrus fruits, and many other crops to the Americas. European livestock, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens, transformed both the ecology and the societies of the New World. In many regions, these introduced species thrived, sometimes at the expense of native flora and fauna. As your consciousness continues its peaceful drift towards sleep, imagine the countless plants and animals making their way across oceans to new environments, finding new homes and changing landscapes and cuisines forever. The most devastating aspect of this biological exchange was the spread of diseases. The Americas had been isolated from Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years, and their populations had no immunity to many Old World diseases. When European explorers and colonizers arrived, they unknowingly brought pathogens like smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and plague. The result was demographic catastrophe. Indigenous American populations collapsed by as much as 90% in many regions within a century of European contact. This massive population decline facilitated European conquest and colonization while causing immense human suffering and the loss of countless communities, languages, and cultural traditions. The exchange of diseases was primarily one directional, though some scholars suggest that syphilis may have originated in the Americas and spread to Europe following Columbus's voyages. The impact of disease on African populations, particularly in regions newly connected to global trade networks, was also significant, though less severe than in the Americas. The age of exploration laid the foundations for European colonial empires that would dominate much of the world for centuries. The Spanish and Portuguese established the first global empires, soon followed by the Dutch, English, and French. These empires operated differently from ancient imperial systems, being overseas rather than contiguous, and focused more on trade and resource extraction than territorial administration. Colonial societies emerged with complex social hierarchies, often based on racial categories. In Spanish and Portuguese America, elaborate systems classified people according to their proportion of European, indigenous, and African ancestry. These racial hierarchies would leave lasting legacies that continue to shape societies in the Americas and elsewhere today. For indigenous peoples worldwide, European expansion brought profound and often traumatic changes. Beyond the devastating impact of disease, many faced conquest, displacement, enslavement, or forced assimilation. Cultural practices, religious traditions, and entire ways of life were disrupted or destroyed. Yet indigenous resistance and adaptation also occurred, with many communities finding ways to maintain aspects of their identity and agency even under colonial rule. The Atlantic slave trade, which transported over 12 million Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries, represents one of the darkest aspects of this era. Initially, the Portuguese established slave trading posts along the West African coast to supply labor for sugar plantations on Atlantic islands and later Brazil. As plantations spread throughout the Americas, the trade expanded dramatically, involving all major European maritime powers. This forced migration created new African diaspora communities throughout the Americas, contributing to the rich cultural diversity of regions like Brazil, the Caribbean, and the southern United States. The economic wealth generated by enslaved labor helped fund European industrial and commercial development, while the moral contradictions of slavery eventually sparked abolition movements that would challenge the practice on humanitarian grounds. The age of exploration and had profound intellectual and cultural impacts beyond the practical realms of geography and commerce. European thinkers had to incorporate new knowledge about lands, peoples, plants, and animals unknown to classical authorities. This contributed to the questioning of ancient wisdom that characterized the scientific revolution and later the Enlightenment. European literature, art, and popular culture absorbed images and ideas from newly encountered worlds. Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, reflects European fascination with newly discovered lands. Montaigne's essays on cannibals introduced relativistic thinking about different cultural practices. The concept of the noble savage emerged as Europeans romantically projected their own social critiques onto indigenous peoples. At the same time, European cultural forms, languages, and religions spread globally through conquest, trade, and missionary activity. Christianity, in particular, became truly worldwide in its distribution, though often adapting to and incorporating elements of local spiritual traditions. European languages like Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French became global languages, used across continents as primary or secondary tongues. As these cross-cultural encounters multiplied, processes of exchange, adaptation, and hybridization created new cultural forms across the world. Musical traditions merged, creating new genres. Artistic styles incorporated elements from different traditions. Cuisines exchanged ingredients and techniques. Religious practices blended and evolved. The cultural diversity of our modern world owes much to these complex interactions initiated during the Age of Exploration. As your thoughts drift toward sleep, consider how our contemporary world was shaped by the voyages we have explored in these chapters. The global economy, with its integrated supply chains and financial systems, began with those early trading networks. The distribution of languages, religions, and cultural practices across continents reflects the population movements and cultural exchanges of this period. Even the foods we eat daily, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, coffee, and countless others, spread globally because of these explorations. The legacy of the great geographical discoveries is neither simply positive nor negative, but profoundly complex. The same processes that created our interconnected world also facilitated conquest, slavery, ecological disruption, and cultural loss. The courage, curiosity, and technical ingenuity displayed by explorers coexisted with greed, cruelty, and cultural arrogance. As modern citizens of a globalized world, we inherit both the achievements and the painful legacies of this transformative era. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the complex origins of our interconnected planet and the diverse cultural heritage that resulted from these encounters. The Age of Exploration reminds us that human history is not a simple narrative of progress or decline, but a complex tapestry of innovation and tradition, connection and conflict, triumph and tragedy. The world we inhabit today, with its global communications, multicultural societies, and environmental challenges began to take shape when those first Portuguese caravels sailed down the African coast and when Columbus's small fleet ventured across the Atlantic. As you drift into peaceful slumber, imagine the wake of those exploring ships still rippling across the oceans of time, reaching our shores today and continuing onward into the future. The human drive to explore, to discover, to connect, and to understand remains as powerful now as it was when Prince Henry's captains first ventured beyond Cape Bojador, when da Gama reached India, when Magellan's crew circumnavigated the globe. The stars that guided those early navigators still shine above us. The same oceans still connect our continents, and the human story they helped to write continues to unfold. Rest now, as the currents of history continue their eternal flow, carrying us all on a journey of discovery that never truly ends.